Over the last half-century, LGBTQ+ Americans have made great strides in social and legal progress. But with change in visibility, there has been backlash. In recent years, and especially this election season, we're witnessing increasing attacks on LGBTQ+ people and the institutions we have used to fight for equality. Welcome to the LGBTQ Nation Roundtable on the state of the movement, the stakes of the election, and a look forward to 2025 and beyond for the LGBTQ+ community. We're sitting down with the leaders of 5 major LGBTQ+ organizations working on issues at the heart of our community, from trans rights to court cases to political organizing and more, for a non-partisan conversation. Joining me is James Black, CEO of the Trevor Project, Kelly Robinson, President of the Human Rights Campaign, Rodrigo Hang Leitinen, Executive Director of Advocates for Trans Equality, Alexis Cantor, Interim President and CEO of Family Equality, and Imani Rupert Gordon, President of the National Center for Lesbian Rights. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
I want to get us started with some context for viewers. Where are we with the progress or lack thereof that the community has made, and what are the stakes of this election?
Easy question.
This is a tiny question to think about.
I do think it's important to ground ourselves in progress because the state of affairs that we're in right now tend to, I think, make us react and sometimes forget, even myself, about all the progress that we've made. I sit here as a Black queer woman with kids and a wife and married. That is progress. We think about Obergefell versus Hodges. That is progress. We have families today. We see more queer leaders in corporate spaces and nonprofit spaces. This panel here is progress. And at the same time, when I think about the work that the Trevor Project does, where you see a 13-year-old having to testify justify for their existence and why they should be able to use a restroom or play sports, that's where we see a lack of progress. And when I think about what's missing, I think about the work that we do, and we're supposed to protect children no matter what. And if our politicians aren't thinking about the stakes and the impact of the laws and the rhetoric on our youth, then what type of country do we have? And so when I think about progress, we really need to think about not only overall progress for LGBTQ plus people, youth and adults, but truly understanding that we have to protect our youth.
Yeah, I can get in on that. Look, I'm with you. After being Black and queer and a woman in America, I don't want to get in a time machine. There's never any time better to be who I am than the moment that we're in right now. And I think acknowledging that is proof of progress. I think the challenge that we're kind of experiencing right now is that there was a moment in the early 2000s. Barack Obama was president. We drank hope and change Kool-Aid. It felt like progress and equality was inevitable. And yet the same story that's always played out in America met us, that we were met with backlash for all the progress that we've made. And I think right now what we're coming to terms with is where America believes that we should be when it comes to equality is not actually where our rights, our laws, and our policy is. And I think that disconnect, that gap for folks, especially young folks, produces a sort of resentment, right? How is it that we've made all this progress when our lives are still feeling so challenged, when, suicidality with our youth is still so high, when Black trans women in the South are still wrestling with fatal mortality rates that are higher than anyone else? How is that possible? So I think our charge right now is to keep the ball moving forward. To me, some of the things that give me hope are the size and the power of our community. I recently read a story from Jodi Patterson. She's a friend of mine and an author, and she talks about how her young child came out at 3 as transgender. And I also, the other week, we got someone sign up to be a member of the Human Rights Campaign who is 103 years old, a World War II veteran, and came out late in life. And to think that we're at a moment where people that are 100 years apart in their age ranges could feel empowered to be their full selves is amazing. And I think that if we can turn that self-empowerment into visibility, if we can turn that visibility into political power, we can actually change our circumstance. But what's at stake right now is profound because we're sitting at that nexus of change that generations have always come to. And the question is, what are we willing to do?
No. Rodrigo, Alexis, Amani, I see you all nodding along.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. Like, we are really at this precipice right now. We are at a fork in the road as LGBTQ people where we, I think, get to choose which way are we going to go down. Are we going to go down this path of continued backlash where all this progress that we've made can be pulled back? Or are we going to get in the driver's seat and keep doing our activism and keep moving things forward? And you said that word backlash. I think that is the perfect word to describe where we're at right now. I mean, for generations, we were making progress as LGBT people, meaning, among other things, that support for us, like everyday people, everyday Americans, were increasingly accepting of us. And then we won on marriage equality at the Supreme Court, and we won on non-discrimination protections in a lot of states. We won adoption rights. I mean, we really made a lot of progress. And then our opposition, anti-LGBT ideologues, got scared. And they said, back to the drawing board, what can we as opposition do to turn that tide back? And they realized trans kids. That's what they realized they can do. They can turn back the tide of support for LGBT people by going after some of the most marginalized part of our community, going after transgender youth who most Americans don't really understand. And by going after trans rights, especially trans youth rights, they can chip away support for all of us queer and transgender people. So I really want to put that into perspective, that our opposition is trying to divide us, trying to make trans people this tiny marginalized group that's pushed back into the shadows. And they're trying to get other LGBT people to be part of that. But the thing is, they are doing that to try to go after all of us at the end of the day. They're trying to go after trans kids to try to go after all LGBTQ people. And now it's our turn as a community to make a decision. Are we going to stand together and fight back, or are we going to tolerate that?
To build on that, when I think about the progress, I see it in my own family. I see it from decades-long corporate career where at first somebody told me, don't tell anyone I was gay, to being out in public for a Fortune 100 company. I think about the progress that I see every day in my family, having an out non-binary 16-year-old and an out Black trans, now young woman who was 23. That progress is us showing up at school conferences. That progress is us showing up at job interviews and at restaurants and having the courage to live authentically and understand the backlash is there, but be powerful in our authenticity. And when I think about family equality, the beauty of family is it's universal. And it is what could unite us all. And instead of there being fear, how do we celebrate, protect, and share the stories of our families? Because at some point, you have to see the humanity in each other to fight that backlash.
We have to figure out what it looks like to end oppression. We have to figure out what that process is. And so I think a lot of times we point to things like marriage equality because that's enormous. And so many people can see their lives represented in such a better way when they're able to marry the folks they love. And we also know that have been huge changes like the Bostock decision that provide tangible changes. And then when we saw that the Bostock decision got extended over other federal agencies, that is, perhaps the single most important thing that's ever happened for LGBTQ people in providing protection.
We're going to dive into so many of the topics that you all mentioned. But one of the themes that emerged from all of your answers is this idea of progress and then backlash. And one of the major areas where we've seen this happen is with DEI. And attacks on DEI are increasing, with several significant corporations pulling back or canceling efforts and withdrawing from the HRC's corporate index. Others are staying the course, but they are feeling the heat. Kelly, what have your conversations been like with business leaders, and how do we push back on efforts to reduce inclusion in the workplace?
When I see kind of the backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's like they're fighting a future that has already arrived. At the end of the day, 30% of Generation Z identify as a member of the community. Our community, the LGBTQ community, has $1.4 trillion of buying power in the United States alone. We are here. And these efforts that you see to roll back equity and inclusion efforts are coming from a specific place, extremists, many of whom who have no business acumen at all are trying to influence the decisions of businesses and corporations at a time when our nation is polarized and divided. For me, I'm very clear. LGBTQ plus inclusion has nothing political about it. So the interesting thing when I talk to companies is that the business case is clear. They understand that the future of the talent base and the workforce is going to be our community and our allies. The question is, how do they do it in this moment right now? And while I feel like the majority of companies have the commitment, we've seen 7 or so companies backtrack, but our Corporate Equality Index is going to have over 1,400 companies representing over 29 million employees across this country participating next year, which is the highest numbers we've ever had. So we know that the progress is moving in the right direction. The question is, how do we make sure that companies and businesses stay the course? That, again, as Rigo said, this important and pivotal moment where extremists want them to do something different.
Purpose-driven companies are exponentially more profitable. Diverse teams create more innovation and bottom line and top line growth. So while I would want people to do it because it's just right, equitable, and we're creating greater freedom and equity for all, if you're not going to do it for that reason and you're a business person, do it because it impacts your bottom line. I mean, it is just the right business decision to make.
I want to add to that. I spent 20-something years in corporate America before transitioning to nonprofit. And there is so much research, as you know, Alexis, that shows that inclusivity, diversity, those companies outperform their peers who are not prioritizing diversity. So number one, there's a performance mechanism there that is good for business. It's good for the economy. But at the same time, I was still in corporate America when George Floyd was murdered. And I think what we're seeing is many of these companies who are falling out were not the companies who were committed in the first place. There are many companies during that time that all jumped on the DEI bandwagon. They invested all these dollars, and a lot of it, and I saw it, was performative. Much of it was performative. And some companies didn't want to go too far. Some wouldn't even put Black Lives Matter on their social media. They didn't want to go too far. We're going to do this, but we don't want to go too far. And I think what they were preparing for is a moment like this to use an excuse for extremists to just push them just a little too much and say, you know what, we got to back out. We're going to lose business. And so I think what you're seeing is I'm encouraged that there are still over 1,000 companies on the CEI.
Over 1,400.
1,400, the CEI. And at the same time, I try not to get discouraged because I do think those companies who are dropping off will not indicate a trend. I think those are companies who are not committed in the first place.
We have to understand that these attacks that we are seeing happen from schools to workplaces to political attacks are coming from the same source of extremism. They don't have anything to do with protecting our families, our rights, our lives, supporting businesses. They come from a politically motivated space. Our job is to find ways to continue this progress forward because, again, the future that they are afraid of, I'm sorry, boo, it's already arrived.
Absolutely. We mentioned some of the attacks that trans youth have been encountering. And for the past few years, we've seen a surge of attacks directed towards trans kids at state legislatures and school districts. According to the HRC, 40% of trans young people live in states that ban gender-affirming medical care. In some, even mentions of the term transgender in public schools are outlawed. James, according to a new study in Nature, there is a direct link between anti-trans laws and youth suicide attempts, increasing rates by as much as 72%. How have you seen this bear out with your work with Trevor?
So this study that we released just last week is pretty groundbreaking because it is the first time that we know that a causal impact, a causal connection has been connected to an enactment of an anti-trans law and the increase in suicide for the youth in that state. And so we took 61,000 children between the ages of 13 and 24, and over a 5-year period, really tried to understand that when a law was enacted in their state and their attempt to or wanting to commit suicide, did that increase? And what the study showed is it absolutely does. And so we need folks in the community to understand what the impacts are. We need our politicians to understand that they are in fact harming the youth and actually increasing the rate of suicide in their state. So it's disturbing. At the same time, we really want to use this study to create better policies, to create change, to really prove that there is a connection. It's not just correlation, there's a connection.
Yeah, and demonstrating that connection of how harmful these bills are to everyday people in concrete terms is so crucial, because it's not even just about the policy that changes. That's already a problem, right? Like, to change the policy in a way that is discriminatory hurts people. But we're finding in studies like this that over and over again, that even debating these kinds of bills on the floor of a legislature harms people, because it sends the message that there is something shameful and wrong about being trans. I mean, at A4TE, we run this United States Transgender Survey, and we found in the last cycle, so this was in December of 2022, that almost half of all transgender people surveyed had actively thought about moving to an entire other state because where they live debated an anti-trans bill. Over half. And these are not only youth. These are trans people of any age who are getting the message from their government that who they are is not considered acceptable, that they are not valued just because of who they are, because of being trans. And, you know, when you think about what would it take to move, uprooting your life, you might have to find a new job, you might have to break your lease, find a whole other home. Oftentimes you're moving to a place that is way more expensive because you're trying to move to some big city that might be more accepting of trans people, and that comes with higher rent. So to think about how extreme it is, how burdensome it is to uproot your life and start all over again in a new place, and then think about roughly half of all trans people are thinking of doing that because the environment in their state has gotten so hostile that that they need to do that and start their lives over again.
Well, one of the things you're getting at is that it oftentimes falls on families or individuals or us as a community to help support these young people in the absence of politicians or school districts that want to step up and do their job. So how can we as a community support young trans folks when others in positions of power don't want to?
Well, I think one huge thing is to educate the people in your life. I mean, most people, like you were saying, still don't know someone who is transgender, don't know us personally.
And they think they don't know. Right, they think they don't know.
Right? I always joke, I'm like, how many people do I interact with who don't clock that I'm a trans guy?
Right. That would be a fun survey. Let's do that.
But I mean, yeah, they don't realize they know someone who's trans, so we are an abstract concept to them. And I think that's true even among LGBTQ people. I mean, a lot of LGBTQ people who are not trans don't yet fully understand everything that goes into being trans, or what does it mean to have a transition-related surgery, or what's actually involved in a trans kid playing on a sports team. And I kind of don't blame people for not knowing, because we are a really small community. But then that makes it all the more powerful when we do get the facts, do get accurate information. You know, go to any one of our websites, we'll fill you in, and then talk to the people in your life about it. So if you hear someone you know saying something, they're kind of wringing their hands about transition-related healthcare, for example, then you can be the one to give them the accurate information. Because a lot of times people don't have hate in their hearts. They just don't really know this, and they haven't encountered it before. And it takes someone like you, someone who has a personal relationship with them, someone who they trust, to be like, you know what, actually it's like this. And then you can be the one to change their mind, and that has a ripple effect.
And I would just say, too, that, we did some work together, James, with the Don't Say Gay or Trans law in Florida. And that was a historic settlement. But one of the things that also that we're reminded is that there are other ways to support our community. You know, if we are really thoughtful around our school boards, if we are thoughtful around our library boards, then we can be the folks that are stopping these book bans before they happen. You know, we can be advocating for our schools before these bills even pop up. And I think that's something we want to remember.
The thing that excites me about the future, when I think about 30% of Generation Z identifying as a member of our community, many of them being trans and non-binary, that means, do you know how many aunties and uncles and parents and siblings that we have that are now newfound allies in this fight? That's powerful. And I think the thing I run into a lot, especially as I travel the country, is a fear but not knowing everything about the trans community means I should say nothing when confronted with the hate and bias in our communities. I think that is one of the most dangerous things in front of us. So to anyone that's listening that's in that position, my response would be that you don't have to know everything. Don't wait on a fact sheet to stand up for people that you love, right? The most important thing that you can do if you know someone or care about somebody who's trans or non-binary is to tell your story. You may not know everything, but you know what it means to love a child that shouldn't be left out or ostracized at school. Many of us, no matter what your identity is, have that experience of feeling different, of feeling isolated. We've got to tell our stories, even if you don't know it all, and then know that organizations like ours have resources for you to learn more. But I guarantee whatever you do know about the community is more than these extremists that are pushing these laws in the states attacking our youth and our kids.
Yeah, that's so real. I mean, on this family tip, like my mom always says, every transgender person is a part of someone's family. And she said that because when I came out as trans, she didn't have a damn clue about anything transgender. But she will say it openly. And she talks about it all the time because of what you said of like, she doesn't want people to feel like they can't say anything because they don't know everything, because they're not, oh, this transgender stuff is political and it's some kind of like nerdy or governmental thing or it's complicated and so I shouldn't wade in. And she's like, I thought that until it turned out my kid was trans and I had no idea. And she was shocked and she talks about it openly. And she's Republican. I mean, she's a former Republican member of Congress.
I was hoping
she
you
was,
mentioned that.
yeah. She GOP voter, total Reagan kind of Republican, and was up for re-election when I got outed as trans. Because first I came out to my family, but then I got outed. Whole other story to the public. And we were all terrified that she was going to lose her re-election just because her kid got outed. And yet, thankfully, she went into mama bear mode and was like, regardless of what the politics are, this is my kid and you don't mess with someone's kid. And amazingly, the voters understood that. In her Republican district, they were like, originally there were a lot of voters who didn't understand anything about trans issues, but were like, I get what it is to be a mom protecting your kid.
Yeah.
And we don't go after parents like that. So I bring that up to say this humanizing piece is really important. It doesn't have to be, transgender rights doesn't have to be that complicated or that in the weeds about policy. You don't have to be an expert on trans kids in sports. You can just know that everyone deserves basic dignity and respect. And that's what you can lead with when talking to the people in your life.
Well, you've all really unpacked the interpersonal ways, the levels of school district and policy ways that we've seen the dignity and rights of trans young people on the table. And this January, the Supreme Court will hear United States v. Scrimeti, which is a case that challenges a Tennessee law banning gender-affirming care for anyone 18 and under on the basis that it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Imani, what are the implications of this case? And what should we expect from the decision, especially in light of Bostock?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of the medical bans that we've seen that legal organizations have been challenging for years, we're going to have an answer for that very, very soon, which is amazing. And, I know that folks are worried about what this looks like. But I also want to be really clear about the question that is in front of the court right now. And that is, are trans folks being discriminated against because of this medical care? And the answer to that is yes. It's actually a pretty narrow question. Most people believe, and you were just talking about this, most people believe that healthcare decisions should be left to the people, their families, their caregivers, their doctors. This is not a decision for the government. And that's what most people believe. But the other part, and I think this part is really important, is that the healthcare that we are talking about is safe healthcare that it's given to non-trans people all of the time. It's given to non-trans people more than it's given to trans people. And so the question here is it discriminatory for trans people? And it is, because we do see puberty blockers given to young kids who sometimes end up in puberty earlier than they think that they when they're quite young, and they're given puberty blockers. Completely safe and a very common practice. We also see that in older age that adults have hormone replacement therapy, having more testosterone if they have low testosterone, or if they are in menopause or perimenopause, that they're having hormone replacement therapy. There are so many ways that we see that trans people are being discriminated against simply because we are talking about healthcare. And so in light of Bostock, that, a lot of the same justices were on this court, I think that we should feel very confident going into this, because it is very clear that we are talking about discriminating against trans people.
I do think, seeing what happened in the Dobbs decision, seeing what happened last summer with Supreme Court cases, and seeing the makeup of this court, people are reasonably afraid. And I think that, for folks that are feeling that, we have to understand that even in Supreme Court decisions, we are not without hope, and we're certainly not without power. Because at these moments, whether they're doing their oral arguments in December or when the decision comes down next year, these are defining moments for us to tell the story of this fight, for us to increase visibility for the trans community and actually give voice to the heart and soul of what this movement is. And we know that the opposition is going to be doing the opposite, spinning their narratives and telling their stories. There's a role for us to play. There are going to be activations where you can show up and organize and mobilize in person. There are going to be opportunities to tell your story. But this is one of those times where if you care about this issue, if you feel like you don't know enough yet, get educated and get involved. Turn all that anxiety you might be feeling into some kind of action that can help us, not just with this case, but in the future of our fight.
Well, continuing to build on ideas around bodily autonomy and all of the ways that they connect to the work that everyone's doing here. Next June marks the 10th anniversary of Obergefell v. Hodges, which legalized same-sex marriage, of course. But we're still seeing barriers to LGBTQ plus family building, from adoption to IVF and fostering, as part of wide attacks on reproductive rights in red states and, of course, as we mentioned, at the Supreme Court. Alexis, though marriage equality is still very popular, how do we also create a broader movement that removes barriers to parenting?
If you think about it, 14 states have licensed to discriminate against LGBTQ people being part of adoption or foster care. And if you think about how many kids need homes, loving homes, every kid deserves a safe place to become themselves. We are limiting who can be parents. And at the end of the day, we have to make sure that we are creating greater access. We need to make sure that we're fighting for policies that afford LGBTQ families to start, form, be celebrated and protected in any way. I mean, the beauty of families is they're created in as many number of ways as you can imagine. I think about my own journey through IUI for one kid, foster care for another, and host home for LGBTQ kids experiencing homelessness. So 3 different ways, all requiring different policies to be in place, different states that we needed to make sure we lived in. So when you think about being a family, I don't know many people who think about starting a family and go, okay, what's my zip code? Where, are we safe? Can we adopt? Can we do second parent? Right? All the things. And so what family equality really wants to focus on is, again, that through line of family as universal.
It's back to the telling our stories about our families. And for me, as a parent who adopted their children, who experienced discrimination throughout that process, I think about the threats on marriage. I was married in Canada because I could not get married here because Obergefell was not the law of the land. So when I think about getting married and having kids, and now we have the threats to Obergefell, and we have threats to IVF access, and we have the 14 states that you just mentioned, it's all coordinated. It is all a way to dehumanize LGBTQ plus folks as people who do not have families, do not deserve families, do not want families, whatever it is. And family's not a partisan issue either. Like, everyone deserves the right to have a family. And to the point that you made about foster care, we are effectively shrinking the pool of parents. There are, 400,000 or so children in the youth system who need parents who are LGBTQ plus. And now we are shrinking that, and these kids are aging out. And so it really is around, yes, we need greater and broader access, but we need to tell our stories. But we also need to know that this is coordinated in terms of our right to family.
We also have to be clear about how fragile our rights are. I was at Planned Parenthood for 13 years before I came to the Human Rights Campaign. And I remember every part of my journey at Planned Parenthood, people said Roe v. Wade would never be overturned. No matter what they're saying out loud, they'd never do it. They never would do it until they did. And we also have to remember that when Roe was overturned, Clarence Thomas in his concurrence said the quiet part out loud. That next he would come for Obergefell and Windsor and Lawrence, key Supreme Court decisions that have established fundamental rights for us. So when I think about what's at stake at election, it's not only the progress that we've made, it's the threat of being dragged back. Because when you look at Project 2025, what they're actually saying is they're going to eliminate the Department of Health and Human Services and instead have a Department of Life that defines the family as a married man and a married woman and their biological kids. Think about how many people that leaves out. Every LGBTQ plus family, but also every family that's got a single parent that's running their household, every family that's adopted their kids, possibly putting at risk families who have developed their kids through IVF and other means. This is really dangerous. I think we have to be really animated about the urgency of this moment, because if this election ends up with an administration or a Congress that is anti-equality, the ways that they can pull us back, it's not just taking back the progress of the last 10 years or the last 50. We're talking about the progress of the last 400 that will be at stake.
Yeah, you shouldn't need a lawyer to form a family.
Yeah, exactly. And I know, too, we often are, when we want to wait until we hear they are coming after your community. But what we have to think about are the ways that our opponents are building laws to intentionally leave us out. And I think that's something we need to pay attention to. And we see that with IVF. We see that it is an intentional effort. It's coordinated, like you said, to make it harder for some of us to start families. And now we hear more rhetoric, too, around what it looks like when professional women don't have kids or don't want to have kids, and delegitimizing different families with blended families, families that use IVF, interracial families. We see that there are coordinated efforts to try to delegitimize who we are and what our families are. And these are things we have to pay attention to. Earlier, I was talking about education and the things that we hear. We have to pay attention that we are hearing right now that folks are saying that our families shouldn't exist. And that we need to pay attention to, not just when they say we're intentionally leaving folks out, but when they're building policy and law so that it will leave us out.
Well, mentioning these efforts of coordinated opposition, in the past few decades, LGBTQ people have gotten civil rights protections and marriage rights at the state level and then federally. And Christian conservatives have turned to a strategy of demanding religious exemptions from such laws, arguing that they can't practice their religion if they're forced to serve LGBTQ plus customers, or if their children have to hear about LGBTQ plus people in their schools. What drives this movement, and how successful of a strategy has this been in the courts?
Yeah, it is something that there has certainly been success here. We see this in a variety of the things that we consider win, that there are religious liberties that are built into these things. And we see that this comes out because there are folks that see that it works from time to time. And what we have to do is get to a place where we're not pitting LGBTQ people against religious folks. We know that LGBTQ people are religious, and we also know that a vast majority of people in this country support LGBTQ folks. And so those are all things we want to consider. And if there are opportunities for us to find ways to create legislation that can have some support for religious institutions and also aren't discriminatory for LGBTQ people, we are going to be in a better place to come up with solutions that way. Respect for Marriage Act has religious exemptions, and that it's protecting during a time. Thank you so much for naming Justice Thomas' concurrence in Dobbs, where he said we need to think about this again. We need the types of protections that are going to protect our families.
Kelly, how have we seen Republicans' arguments for religious exemptions impact potential federal protections like the Equality Act?
Yeah, I mean, the challenge, I think, with the Republican arguments is that they're not coming from a place of building sound policy. They're really coming from a place of institutionalizing discrimination in whatever way that they can. So when we think about the Equality Act, I think the biggest thing that people don't realize is that right now there are not federal non-discrimination protections for the LGBTQ plus community. It comes as a surprise to a lot of people that I can be kicked out of a restaurant in Texas and I've got to figure out, is it because I'm Black? Is it because I'm a woman? Or is it because I'm queer? Because not all of those are protected categories. So I think that our task right now is to make sure that people understand what our rights are and where we still have to push. And that we're really correcting the record on some of the, quite frankly, lies and misinformation that unfortunately, some of our opposition spreads that confuses people about what is really at stake.
On the topic of these lies and confusing disinformation, Moms for Liberty, Libs of TikTok, and other online accounts have based their entire argument on the idea that parents can opt their kids out of any lessons that contradict their values, and that they should know everything about their kids, even information that their kids are afraid to share with them. Rodrigo, you got at this earlier, but this is a message that seems to resonate with the center, especially when it comes to trans kids. And we've even seen it drive a wedge within the LGBTQ plus community. So how can you address disinformation that tries to take advantage of what might be actual concerns from these parents?
Well, I think one thing that's really persuasive to bring up is that I think, can all agree that for the most part, parents should and are included in these kinds of decisions for their kids. And what we need to guard against is the rare but still happens a situation where a kid isn't safe at home. You know, all of us want every child to be in a kind of environment where the kid can talk really straightforwardly with their parents and say, hey, I'm questioning my gender, I'm questioning my sexual orientation, and the parent will be loving and accepting towards them. And so we want to live in that world. The reality is that although most parents have kids' best self-interest, best interest at heart, some don't. And some parents aren't there yet. And for some kids, if their parents find out that they're questioning, then they are going to be out on the streets. They are going to be abandoned. They are going to be rejected by the people who are supposed to be taking care of them. So that's why we need these protections in schools, so that teachers aren't forced to out kids to parents who might not actually accept them. For the most part, teachers do stay in touch really closely with parents of their students, and that works really well. But for those times where the parent's not going to be accepting, where there's a risk of homelessness and violence and abuse, the teacher needs to be able to protect the child and shield the child from that kind of risk. And that's really what these protections are about. When we talk about why kids shouldn't be outed at school, that's really the basic bread and butter thing that we're trying to do. We're trying to protect every kid so that every kid keeps a roof over their head no matter what.
I do think a big piece of it comes back to the overall environment that we're in. I mean, we talked a lot about the impact of, HRC declared a national state of emergency for LGBTQ plus people last year. That wasn't only in response to the hundreds and hundreds of anti-LGBTQ plus bills, but what else it was doing. It was creating an environment that contributed to 1 in 4 of every hate crime being motivated by anti-LGBTQ plus bias. We saw when state bills were introduced that attacked the community, we saw a 400% increase in online bullying and harassment targeted at kids online. So we've got to be clear that part of solving the challenge that folks are experiencing online is also fixing the environment that we are in politically and legislatively. So I think this is a moment where we need to be holding all the adults accountable. You got to be clear that the things that you are saying are supporting and motivating increased hate and bias towards our kids online.
Yeah, I agree with Kelly. And you have to hold the adults who are running these companies accountable. That's number one. And I think the studies and the data that GLAAD is actually putting out are really helpful. But on the Trevor side, what we understand is that it's going to take some time to fix this system. It's broken. And our kids, they all need internet, right? They all use the phones. That's all they do is spend time on social media. So how do you make that environment safer for them? And so we have a platform called Trevor Space. And that is a safe space for LGBTQ plus youth to connect with others, to build community, to be in a safe place where they're not bullied. That's a solution, right? I think sometimes we have to sort of extract and build our own platforms and build our own ways when we know that the other systems are broken. So while we're fighting the good fight and holding these folks accountable through legislation and conversations, we also have another platform for our youth when they don't have a safe place to go.
Yeah, and this is so critical because for so many of us in our community, we're out online long before we're out anywhere in real life. I mean, for transgender people especially, I think a large part of the reason that our movement accelerated and made so much progress in recent years, in the last 20 years or so, was the rise of the internet, actually, because we're a small population. We're maybe somewhere around 1% of the population. There are not that many of us. But we are living all over the country. We're in urban, rural, suburban areas just as much as at the same rate as the general population. And we know this from the U.S. Transgender Survey and many other surveys. We find we are part of the fabric of society spread evenly throughout the country. And so we're often in these communities, physically in these communities, where we think we're the only one. We think we're the only transgender person in this town. And where we're able to connect and build solidarity and support is online. So many of us are out online for years before we ever dress differently in public or style our hair differently. And this is especially the case for youth, for young people who may not be able to go to a community center on their own or a support group on their own because they're too young to have their own transportation or whatever barriers they're facing. They feel like they're going to get caught by their parents if they do it. So it is especially important that we make the internet a safe place to be openly LGBT, and especially an openly LGBT young person or questioning young person, because usually online is the only place you can do it for quite a while before you have the confidence or ability to do it elsewhere.
Moving to a conversation happening within the LGBTQ plus community online and off. Over the past year of the Israel-Hamas war, U.S.-based LGBTQ plus organizations have faced calls to back a ceasefire. What is your organization's role in taking a public stance?
It's such a complicated issue that I don't think any of us in this experience can truly understand. And I don't want to even pretend to understand it. But what I do know is, as a human and as a mom, to see the images that I've seen on television, that is greatly disturbing. And we also know that the folks at our organization are seeing those same images. We know that the youth that we serve are seeing those same images. So for us, it really is about when people are feeling all the feelings that makes you feel, seeing what's going on globally, and then even connecting it to how they're feeling here, that we're there for them. And that's really the perspective that we are taking, is that we are there for the youth who are greatly affected by what they're seeing on TV. Not just here, but they're also looking at what's going on globally, and it's affecting them greatly. And so how do we ensure that we're there for them?
Yeah. I mean, it's clear and it's acute that the fight for dignity and justice is a global fight that we are all a part of. I think the last year has been devastating in so many ways, but how it's called into question who is a human and whose humanity deserves dignity, I think, has been the most challenging part of it all. As we sit here a year later, I don't think that there's anyone that can deny the need for a ceasefire, the need for peace, not just in the region, but around the world. I mean, you see this conflict playing out in the Middle East and spreading, and you also see what's happening in Sudan and in the Congo, and we're at a point of crisis in the world. I think that when I think about the path forward, especially for some of our organizations, it's really about how do we continue to build movement in a world that is fractured and at crisis? And what does it look like to create entry points for people, no matter where they are, to be a part of this global fight? And I can say, as a leader, it is not an easy one. I think we've had to sit in the heart of it all. We've had to catch the tears from staff, from partners all around the world as we kind of wrestle with this moment. But it's also probably one of the things that's most important for us to do, to sometimes sit in principled struggle together and understand what that feels like and what it looks like, and to not be afraid to look at the depths of the darkness that our world experiences, because it's only through doing that I think we can try to find the light together again.
You mentioned sitting in principled struggle. Pro-Palestinian protesters have called on HRC to call for a ceasefire in Gaza and end the organization's relationship with weapons manufacturers that have supplied the Israeli military. What's your response?
I think, well, we have called for a ceasefire and also been a part of a lot of movement activities are about kind of lifting up what's happening in the region and the impact that it has around the world. I mean, for me, especially as a human rights campaign, where a lot of our work focuses domestically, understanding that the same forces of anti-Semitism and bias against the Arab community and Islamophobia are the things that are happening here in the United States as well. We were one of the earliest organizations to speak out on the crisis that's happening in the Middle East, and also to kind of shine a light on the ways that anti-Semitism and homophobia and transphobia and Islamophobia were connected in the United States, specifically calling out some of the extremist actors. I mean, the same folks that tried to take down Claudine Gay are the people that have been developing anti-LGBTQ, particularly anti-trans policies in the United States. So I think that the Human Rights Campaign has a specific role to play. I also think that we have to be clear-eyed about the reality of what partnerships need to look like in the United States for us to advance progress. You know, for us, we see the United States military as being the largest employer of trans people in the country, as being one of the largest employers in the country, period, and one of the largest employers of the LGBTQ plus community. So for us, we've been able to partner in that space where people sometimes don't have the choice of whether or not they take these jobs and opportunities, to make sure that don't ask, don't tell is no longer the law of the land. So I think that we, again, sometimes have to sit in this principled struggle, but the value and at the core of all of our work is always making sure that LGBTQ plus people, particularly in the United States, no matter where you have to work or where you have to live or who you love, that you get the same dignity and respect in all areas of your life. And that's kind of what our partnerships and ethos have always been about.
Now, early voting is already underway in several states. And we so far have talked about what's at stake for LGBTQ people at the Supreme Court, across state level legislation, and even the role of online hate. But I wanted to put into context what the next 4 years will look like depending on who wins the presidential election. What are each of your organization's plans, and what will your work look like if Trump wins the election? And what will it look like if Harris wins the election? What are you planning for?
Well, we at A4TE are planning for every scenario, as I'm sure all of us are. And one thing I want to remind all of us of is that, yes, it's the presidency, but it's also Congress. And so when we're doing our scenario planning, we're thinking about what does it mean if it's Harris versus if it's Trump in the White House? But also, what does it mean depending on whether Democrats or Republicans have control of the House of Representatives, have control of the Senate? It is very understandable that the presidency gets a lot of attention when we think about elections. It's merited. The presidency is a big deal. But also, who has control of Congress is going to have a huge influence on what we can get done, no matter who's in the White House. So I really encourage everybody to vote and go all the way down the damn ballot.
Up and down.
Think about, everyone who's on there. And I know it can seem overwhelming, like a lot of information to process. But, we've got resources at transformthevote.org. I'm sure all of our organizations have resources where you can put in your zip code, put in your information, and we'll help you figure out, are you registered? What are your deadlines? Do you have early voting? Do you want to request a vote by mail ballot? And what is on your ballot? Because there's going to be judges. There's going to be school board members, like Imani was saying. There's going to be judges in some places. And all of these decision makers are going to shape the rules that you get stuck living under for the next several years. So the presidency is important, but so are all these other races. Definitely check your registration, make sure it's current, and vote all the way down the ballot.
I'm excited. I mean, about this election. We got days left to go. There are 75 million equality voters across this country that prioritize LGBTQ plus issues when deciding who to vote for. We can be the difference makers in this election in so many states and so many places and across the country. We've just got to show up. And then when we show up, I think we also have to remember that November 5th is a very important day, right? And I also want to remind people that's the last day of the election, not the first. You can do a lot of stuff between now and then to affect the outcome. But even on November 5th, on the other side of that is still work to be done. If Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are in the White House, great. That means it's time for us to make sure that they make good on their promises to us and our community and advocate and be there on day one. If Donald Trump is in the White House, okay, take a breath, have a beverage of your choice. I like chocolate milk, have whatever you like. But then we got to get back to work too, because the fight for equality doesn't start or stop with an election. It is a generational fight that we're in the midst of. And I think that right now, especially when we think about the power of our community, the generations that are part of this fight, we have the power to do something special together. It's not only determined by who sits in the White House, it's determined by what we do every single day in our communities.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. And look, you talked about what our organizations are doing, and Rodrigo mentioned scenario planning. So there are multiple scenarios that we are all planning through, what we would call best case or worst case. But for us, for Trevor, our work is so critical because we are saving lives every single day. We will work with any administration who finds that saving LGBTQ plus youth is critical and important. And so, yes, there are different outcomes that can happen based on who's in the White House. But what we are looking at is how do we ensure that the Trevor Project's work is available to our youth regardless of the political outcome?
One of the things that is exciting me most in this moment is that this will be the first election that many Gen Zers get to vote in. And we mentioned a little bit earlier that they're identifying as queer in far greater numbers than older generations. Close to 3 in 10 Gen Z women, 28.5% identify as LGBTQ+, compared with 10.6% of Gen Z men. And additionally, while GLAAD has reported that overall media representation is down, we've still seen amazing releases like Heartstopper, and I'm really excited to see Will and Harper.
So good.
Yeah, so where are your sources of inspiration coming from these days, and what are the next steps in our long march for equality?
Well, one thing I'm really inspired by is how active our community is. I mean, we are activists through and through. We found in our U.S. transgender survey here at A4TE that transgender people are way more likely to vote than the average person, the non-transgender people who in these surveys, and are more likely to be registered to vote. And so, even though I was saying earlier, we're such a small population, still we vote in outsized numbers. And that is remarkable, especially when you think about all the barriers that there might be to voting. If you're trans, you probably had to change your name and probably changed your appearance. And so now you might have an ID with a photo that you're like, that doesn't even look like me anymore. And a lot of us hate our driver's license photos, but especially trans people. That is your old self. And, James and I were just talking earlier today about how hard it is to update the name on your ID. I mean, so for a lot of trans people in states with voter ID laws, it can feel like it's hard to vote. And still, trans people are showing up at the polls at higher numbers than non-trans people, in spite of all that. So that gives me a lot of inspiration. Like, despite the hardship that LGBTQ people admittedly face, we are doing something about it. We're not just passively watching oppression happen to us. We're in the driver's seat. We are empowering ourselves, and we're doing something about it. So I've derived a lot of inspiration from that.
I like right on. And when I get excited that families that vote together hope together, right? And things are hard. And I'm inspired when I see young people fight. I'm inspired when I watch my kid. It makes me more courageous every day. I'm inspired by every single person up here, because before I was sitting on a stage with this incredible group, I was sitting in the corporate world quoting them and their organizations trying to make a difference. And so it is impossible. If you just pause and take a look around, it is impossible not to be inspired every day by the people who are fighting or living authentically or just being courageously themselves. I loved Will and Harper, but it doesn't take that, right? It doesn't take just seeing the star. It takes that person in your community center, that person in the grocery store. And for me, that's where I find hope.
Absolutely. You mentioned the changing of your ID and how difficult that is for trans and non-binary folks. And I have to say that when that ID was changed and I saw the gender marker X and, in the state that I live in, that was such a source of pride for me that I wanted to, go out and knock on doors or something. Like, I just felt so motivated to be able to transition into who I want to be in this country. And I'm like, yeah, things are bad, but damn it, this just happened. And now what else do I need to do to ensure that everyone who wants that experience can have that experience? So I'm inspired by that. I'm inspired by our trans community, my children, our youth. The youth are they are fierce. And I know no 13-year-old or 14-year-old should have to justify or testify for their existence, but they are. And I cannot even imagine doing that when I was 13 years old, just watching Nickelodeon or something. I was worried about different things. And these kids are so brave. And so as someone who is a lot older than him, I get a lot.
I know why you're leaning a lot.
Put that on thick.
She knows why. A lot.
It's so beautiful to gain inspiration from the youth and to learn so much from them, because I think that each of us can probably say that they are inspiring our strategies and our fight in many ways. So it's not just listening to them, but it's also saying, what are they saying, and what part of what they're saying can we actually add to our mission and to our vision and to our talking points, to our strategy? That motivates.
And giving those kids a seat at our table too, because if I think about all of our organizations, we're made better by multiracial, multi-gender, multi-generational, because it changes the conversation.
And that we're staying in this fight, that even in the times that we don't get the outcomes that we want, and we should get them, we're fighting for civil rights, we're fighting for fairness and equity. And these losses, when we have them, are painful, but continuing to go and spend extra time writing that brief, to go and not make this easy on our opponents. Because, when we look at our civil rights fight, it has been because folks have lost, got back up, and then kept fighting, because you never know when something's going to switch, when something's going to turn, and that those turns are often watershed moments. It's not a little thing, but it turns into a much bigger one. That I know that there are young people that are inspired to see leaders that represent them, and I know that we are inspired by young folks that are doing amazing work and wanting to do the things that we can do to make the world better and safer for them. And that part is just very inspiring to me, and I'm so proud to be part of this movement and to work for the National Center for Lesbian Rights.
You better plug the National Center for Lesbian
I love it. That's my favorite part. It was just like, no, but I was just, I'm just feeling I'm feeling a lot of love for it right now. It's, we're a litigating organization. This is hard work right now. And, in half the states, we're seeing that trans kids can't play sports or get the medical care they need. I'm really feeling this right now. There are a lot of ways where we see losses happening, and I feel really proud that folks want to get up and do this again. It's hard when a lot of other work that we're doing is litigating in ways that, these things go in waves, and we're feeling something right now.
For me, I think I kind of said that in jest, but it's the joy for me right now, and it's the hope. I mean, if you were to have this panel 10 years ago, you'd probably be looking at a lot of maybe cis white men that were on the stage now, but look at us. We represent a different generation of LGBTQ plus leadership. Youth are looking at us. And when I think about this moment, where not only are we sitting on this stage, but you have the first Black woman and South Asian woman that's running to be president of the United States. You have somebody running to be vice president of the United States who, in his story, to show his character, talks about how he was the coach of a rural Minnesota high school football team and the Gay Straight Alliance advisor. This is a moment in time where we're not just fighting back against something. The stories that we're sharing are not just ones of desperation and trauma, but we're actually unlocking the hope of what could be possible if there weren't barriers and glass and rainbow ceilings that were capping our leadership and our development. So to me, when I think about this election, the thing that's so inspiring is that we're leading from a place of hope, from a place of joy, and a place of abundance. Anything could be possible on the other side.
A place of abundance. I think that is the perfect note to end this conversation on. Thank you all so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you. To see LGBTQ Nation's election coverage, please visit the Equality for All Election News Center at lgbtqnation.com.